I think tall buildings are an inevitable part of city life. And they play an important role in cities, defining the character and reducing urban sprawl. However, when a building rises above the others, it has a duty to provide excellence in its architecture. And this is where the competition system comes in, I think, because as you've just heard, the competitions can produce great buildings and also gives the opportunity for up-and-coming and emerging architects to win a major project. But having won the Crown Sydney project, I can show you some of my experience from that competition, and also I'm going to draw comparisons from 4 other competitions around the world, so you can see how they've been undertaken and how we can learn from them, I guess. So Crown Sydney was the first project that I'd like to talk about. It's been controversial, but when I first saw the site, I thought it was the most beautiful place, and it needed a sculptural building form. It's right on the northwest corner of the CBD, and so it's out on a limb in a way. And the brief for the competition came out the day we broke up for Christmas, so I took it away with me on holiday and spent most of the holiday trying to work out what to do. And for this, I drew inspiration from nature and from a sculpture I'd been working on previously. And this led to a narrative of 3 petals. The image on the left here was a sculpture I'd been working on a few years before. And I thought there was an opportunity to join up the petals to create accommodation so that it would be a sculptural tower that would twist initially through 90 degrees. We changed it to 60 degrees. It would twist, and the space between the petals would twist with it and grow in size and then reduce as it went to the top. So it became a very sculptural form. And when I came back from the holiday, we put it straight through onto testing it out with a Rhino model. And I thought there was some possibilities here. It seemed to be producing some kind of quality spaces and forms which could work very well for the site, I felt. So the next thing was to move on to talk to Arabs about how we would make it work structurally. And it seemed that it was doable, that you needed a central core with outriggers, and perhaps the most complicated bit was the perimeter columns, which would be twisting with the building, so they have to follow the form. So these are very unusual to have helical columns following the twist of the form. So the next thing was to deal with the external skin, and there are obviously problems with a very curvy form, but we could deal with most of the issues with stepped vertical glazed panels, which needed to be cold pressed. Some of them needed to be cold pressed to take up the tolerance of the curvature. But that worked pretty well. The only thing was that on where the curves are more acute, we needed to triangulate the system. But I like that. I like the idea that we have different glazing systems for different reasons in different places. It gives it a sort of interesting diversity, really, and quality. So the other aspects to do with the shape are that each plan had to be drawn out even at competition stage. The competition was run over 3 months with an interim workshop after 6 weeks in London. And we couldn't get away with just drawing the odd floor plan. We had to draw every one because every floor's different. And the schedule of accommodation in the competition was very precise, so we had to meet those terms of the competition program. And then we had a whole load of other issues to deal with. Public realm here, we had a very tight site, but on the waterfront, so we tried to make the most of the waterfront to create cafes, bars, restaurants that everyone could enjoy using. And we tried, in order to make them more interesting, they're seated in gardens, so they're quite exotic planting around each of these cafes, bars and restaurants, and it opens out onto the boardwalk. There have been discussions about the fact that we've extended beyond the site. In fact, we haven't. The site was very prescribed in the purchase arrangements with the government. And the one thing that could never change would be the position of the building or extend beyond the site. So a lot of things that you read in the papers are simply not true. When it comes to a hotel, the entrance is very important, and we tried to make the ground floor as permeable as possible. This is the porte cochere, which you drive into, as light and bright as possible. And the feeling of, actually, when you're in there, you're looking out onto the park. And there's a sort of, we tried to keep it open and airy and light and sparkly, really. You can see here the ground plan is actually very permeable. You come in the porte cochere into reception, you can see right through to the waterfront, and you can walk through in 2 directions there. There's a street within the building which has shops and restaurants, which leads through to the harbour. And I accept that, with a 6-star hotel, it's not everybody's cup of tea to walk in. It's always slightly intimidating. I feel the same myself when I go into a 6-star hotel, but we tried to make it as open as possible. And on the upper levels of the podium, it's a resort hotel, so there are a lot of other uses, such as swimming pools, gyms, tennis court. There's a lot of leisure activities within the building. And you can see here how on the top floor, how you'd have the pool, infinity pool, right overlooking the harbour. And there are places where people get, they have their wedding receptions, all sorts of parties and so on. And it's been very much designed to try to create this sort of life and activity for the public that use it. And at the top, the other thing about tall buildings is how it meets the sky. And here you can see the 3 petals come through to the sky, and they create a sort of interesting shape on the skyline. And after the competition, I should say that it was a risk I took to discuss, rather than go through the building in its normal architectural way. I talked very much about the narrative and how we'd arrived at the design. And afterwards, the client was unhappy with the appearance of the podium. And I thought about it and sent him this sketch with a couple of images of sculptural Gothic stonework, and he suggested that it might be in marble, and surprisingly the client really liked it, and he accepted that it was incredibly expensive and very difficult to build, but we made a mock-up of in marble. This is a 200 millimeter square block of marble, 1.5 meters high, and they're all tied together with steel cables, so it's tensioned up. And this is the effect that you get of the look of the podium onto the park and onto the waterfront. And this is what I wanted to achieve, which was a sort of filigree stonework idea. And so this is, the building's about 100 meters long, so this stonework is going all around the building, and it's quite a strong concept, because the building's actually set back from the surface with a series of terraces and walkways, so there's a depth to the facade which comes out a little bit like some buildings in the past. And just to look at the idea of what it might look at night, and the models that we produce, and some visuals that are coming out now of the building on its own. You can see that it defines the northwest corner of the CBD there, and how it works with the Richard Rogers buildings and the Renzo Piano buildings, and the height of it. The height was a discussion where we were sticking to the overall height of 250 meters, which is a restriction in Sydney, but we were encouraged actually by higher forces, the government and so on, to push it beyond the 250 meters, so it goes up to 275 meters. It caused a lot of chaos and outcry in the papers. It wasn't our idea, but actually it works, and I think it's opened up the possibility for the city. So I'm going to move on now to another project we're doing, and in Australia, in Melbourne. And what's interesting about this is that this has also had quite a lot of press attention, mainly because of the height of the building. It's just a little over 300 meters, and the proximity to its neighbors, which I totally understand, but it's a mixed development of apartments and hotel, and our clients were keen to maximize the site potential. And so there were a lot of discussions about how one might do this. I mean, as far as we were concerned as architects, trying to reduce the visual bulk, which we did by splitting it into 3 curved elements, so that it's articulated and it's still a sort of vertical extrusion. And we played around with the spaces between the buildings, and the one thing we were able to offer as far as the public realm was a major contribution in funds to the walkway along the river and Queensbridge Road, so there's quite a lot of work going to go into the landscaping of that. And we opened up the top few floors of the building to the public, so it's a sort of sky bar, restaurant, cafe. It's also there for event. It's a big event space, and it's a sort of window on the world from the top of the building. So this is that sort of some of the views from the top space. Because I think at least, you know, one of the exciting things about going to a tall building is when you're up at the top, enjoying the views and the spaces, looking down on the city. So something very different here in Toronto. We won a major competition for to move the financial district towards the river, towards the lake, jumping over the railway, because Bay Street is the main financial district, but it stops with the railway line, and then you have a major highway between that and the lake. And there was an interest in trying to move the city towards the lake, which we did by having two towers, one on either side, connected by a park above the railway lines. I should say that this site was previously occupied by a major coach and bus station, and the scheme requires rebuilding the coach and bus station, which was in pretty bad state, as part of the main development. So there's a huge public gain from the idea of improving the communications and linking it back to the station and to the other parts of the city. Otherwise, it's a fairly straightforward. This is the first tower, phase one. Both towers have been pre-let, and the first tower has started construction. It follows a sort of typical American form of a rectangular shape with a central core, but we've split the rectangle down into two squares with an articulated joint between, and this reduces the mass, the visual mass of the building. And we've played with the glazing treatment. Over 10 floors, we've got a pyramidal cross-brace system of glazing, which actually it gives it a sort of pyramidal look, but it's only 750 millimeters deep from the structure to the outside. But it's amazing what difference that makes to the light. So it catches the light on each facade in a different way according to the time of day. And the big bonus was the park over the railway tracks, which actually connect to some greening that they were doing to the Union Station anyway. But it's, I think it's going to be a great contribution to the city to have this park, which is a bit short of space at that time, at that place. And now I'm going to move on to London, which is always a difficult place to build. I mean, London is, it's a historic city, and one has to respect that. But as was discussed in the plenary system, because Canary Wharf was taking all the people from the centre of the old city, the city decided to allow some high-rise development right in the centre, but to control it and build it. And the controls are due to, they all relate to St. Paul's, views of St. Paul's Cathedral from different places around the city. And in a way, it's a kind of way of controlling views, but also it actually coordinates what's going on in the city. And we were behind St. Paul's Cathedral, but we had to stay within the red line of the Rogers Stirk Harbour building, which is known as the Cheese Grater, which has an angular facade. So the only way we could deal with it to maximize the development potential was a series of stacked boxes. That was the sketch, and this is how the building turns out. And it seemed a little bit unusual, and perhaps to other people from other cities it's ridiculous. But on the other hand, if you look at the idea that it stops the vertical extrusion, the typical vertical extrusion, it creates a series of layers which have gardens on, and it creates a series of different size shapes. So at ground floor, it's quite big, and it's actually on a very important corner of Leadenhall Street, Bishopsgate. So it's a kind of gateway into the city. As you go up, it steps back with this series of boxes to quite a narrow series of floor plates on the tower. And actually, this has proved to be quite an interesting result, because in the past, developers have always said, well, we must have a minimum of 15,000 square feet or 20,000 square feet in order for it to work. But actually, that's not the case, because when you get a variety of different size floor plates, you have many more options from the letting point of view. And these smaller floor plates are working really well in the city, because you've got a lot of high-end users. You don't need a lot of space, but they want a really good location. So I'm going to move on to my last project, which some of what you will have seen before. It was the first competition we did in 2000. We won in 2005 in Guangzhou. And it was part of a master plan that the city planners had with to create a sort of garden city going down to the Pearl River, the Zulang New Town they called it. And there would be 2 high-rise towers. Our one was a West Tower, and it was completed in 2010, 2011. But it's, as with Chinese developments, it isn't just one building. It's actually 4.5 million square feet with a shopping centre, convention centre, and housing, as well as office and hotel above. And the competition, in the competition, we had to consider seismic problems as well as wind, and working with Arabs, we came up with this diagrid structure, which actually is kind of unusual, but it makes it quite an interesting space, because it allows us to open up an atrium for the hotel above. So if you can imagine 69 floors of offices, reception for the hotel on the 70th floor, and then 35 floors above that of atrium. So that's as tall as St. Paul's Cathedral I was talking about, just on the atrium space. So it's a pretty extraordinary building, quite simple on the outside, deceptively simple, because it's complicated actually, but what we tried for was an elegant simplicity, and that involved quite a complex geometry of a triangular form, which opens out, gets bigger up to the 3rd point, and then reduces down to the minimum at the top where the hotel is. And I can finish on this, but I'd just like to draw a few conclusions. We've had discussions about all these things, but my feeling is that cities should maintain their special character, but this doesn't preclude high-rise buildings, as we've shown in the City of London. They have to be carefully planned. They have to have the public realm. You have to deal well with the public realm. You have to deal with the tops of the buildings when they're showing above the other buildings. But the emphasis must always be on the quality of architecture. Thank you very much.